The war between Ukraine and Russia has completely flared up as of December. When Vladimir Putin launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine in February, few thought that Ukrainian forces would threaten to retake Crimea 9 months later. However, this no longer feels like a military impossibility, after Kiev's well-organized troops showed that they could repulse Russian forces in offensive operations around Kharkiv in the northeast of Ukraine and Kherson in the south. Ukraine's recent victories in northeastern and southern Ukraine are fueling confident talk about Crimea in Kiev. And since Russian forces withdrew from the peninsula's northernmost city of Kherson, 130 kilometers away, the chorus has only grown louder as more of the peninsula arrives. For Putin, Crimea has long been a holy cause. Vladimir Putin called Crimea an integral part of Russia, causing many in the West to fear that it could be a strategic red line. Due to its strategic location on the Black Sea, Crimea has always had an oppositional past and has always been mentioned as the reason for the start of serious wars between great states. Crimea retains all its magic like a precious treasure that cannot be shared between the two countries. Ukrainian leader Zelensky reiterates at every opportunity that the war began with the annexation of Crimea. The Kiev leader adds that the war will not end until the liberation of Crimea. Ukrainian officials are mocking Russia, saying that Crimea will soon come under Ukrainian control. Both leaders' thoughts on Crimea are escalating tensions. Crimea hosts many hot events. Let's take a look at the chain of events that took place in Crimea. Ukrainian forces are ramping up the pace of military activity in and near Crimea, both using airborne and innovative naval drones to encircle and strike Russian warships stationed in Sevastopol, the Russian Navy's main base in the Black Sea, in October and recently. Also known as the Kerch Bridge, the Crimean Bridge was hailed as the construction of the century by Russian media when it first opened in 2018, 4 years after Moscow's illegal annexation of Crimea. Since August, Ukrainians have pursued Russian targets in Crimea, including air bases and ships, but tensions escalated dramatically after an explosion on October 8th that damaged the Kerch Bridge, a vital supply line between Russia and Crimea. Given the importance of the Kerch Bridge as both a strategic and symbolic project, it was also a great embarrassment for President Putin. People in Crimea say that the Russians are nervous and are pursuing pro-Ukrainian sympathizers, fearing further acts of sabotage. Kiev never formally claimed responsibility for what was most likely a truck bombing. Dramatic events in Crimea continue unabated. Last night, Ukraine struck the Nizhegorodsky district in Crimea, once again reminding of its presence there. Crimea is having exciting moments with the Ukrainian drone. The explosion thunders near the village of Nizhegorodsky in Crimea. A violent explosion occurred in Nizhegorodsky in eastern Crimea. The explosion was carried out by a kamikaze drone aimed at attacking the local railway junction or oil depot located there. The possibility that the drone carried out this attack belongs to Ukraine fuels the concerns in the Kremlin. Local residents managed to record the explosion, which took place at night. Shortly before the explosion, the local people heard gunfire and the sound of the drone and did not neglect to record the moment of the attack. As can be seen from video footage, the skies of Crimea are experiencing a sudden enlightenment. It is a Ukrainian drone that pierces the silence of the night on the streets of Crimea. With the intensity of the explosion, the red color dominates the sky. The attack on Ukraine creates fear in the region. At the same time, the severity of the explosion is enough to worry local residents. Published video footage also reflects people's hectic voices. No comment was made on the extent of the damage caused by the explosion. There is no official statement about this at the moment. However, exactly how the drone reached the eastern part of the peninsula is still unknown. But there are claims that the drone may have been launched from the territory of the Donetsk region, that is, the attack was carried out from the sea. Ukraine intensifies its attacks in Crimea. Currently, civilians are being evacuated periodically and regularly, while the number of Russian soldiers in Crimea is increasing. Clashes will flare up in Crimea very soon, and the population of the peninsula is aware of this and is fleeing quickly. War experts predict that the Ukrainian military could take control of the occupied Crimean peninsula by August 2023. The landing of Ukrainian soldiers in Crimea will mean the end of Putin's political life. Let's leave aside the developments regarding Crimea and turn our route to Belarus. Putin and Lukashenko have met many times over the past 3 years, but until December 19th, always in Russia or in third countries. Putin's arrival at Lukashenko this time was seen by analysts as proof that he really wanted something. If what Lukashenko wants is to send Belarusian troops to Ukraine to fight alongside the Russian forces, all signs show that she does not understand him. At a joint press conference, the two made vague statements about the continuation of military cooperation and strengthening joint efforts in all areas, as Putin puts it. Russia used Belarus as a staging area for some of the force that crossed the north into Ukraine in February and advanced towards Kiev, but met with stiff resistance and withdrew within weeks, leaving a trail of destruction, death, and alleged persecution. The retreating Russian forces also received medical care in Belarus, and Russian forces are training there. But so far, Lukashenko has not seen Belarusian forces to fight in Ukraine. However, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who relied on Vladimir Putin to stay in power following the widely seen 2020 election, is testing whether his country's troops are ready for war. Ukraine follows Belarus closely. While the Ukrainian Defense Forces controlled the Belarusian border, no movement of the Russian and Belarusian military equipment directly near the border was recorded. We can also say that Belarus and Russia are escalating the situation further towards the Ukraine-Belarusian border, so that Ukraine's defense forces hold the necessary amount of power to potentially repel, rather than direct, further attempts of aggression in the region. But we think that the buildup of Russian forces in Belarus is part of Moscow's plan to set the terms for a renewed invasion of northern Ukraine, possibly targeting Kiev. When we look at the developments in the Ukraine-Russian war, we realize that Vladimir Putin is drifting towards a dead end. The actions that took place in this strategically important city, especially in Crimea, show that Vladimir Putin was right in this fear. There's little time left until the end of the first year of the war, but in this process, Russia received deep wounds. The Russian leader has essentially already lost the strategic engagement in Ukraine. Putin does not appear to be in a position to achieve strategic goals such as capturing Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and capturing the entire Black Sea coast, including the port city of Odessa. Putin is playing the long game. He is betting that a protracted conflict will play to Russia's advantage, as the Russian leader failed to deliver a definitive knockout punch in the early stages of the war. This is not an unreasonable assumption, because a prolonged war will require sustained and increased Western military aid, and political support for such aid is dwindling in Europe and the United States. Also, some members of Congress reacted negatively to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Washington, D.C. earlier this week. Republicans in particular targeted Zelensky's request for additional help so Ukraine could continue to fight Russia's aggression. If Ukraine cannot recoup its losses with new equipment and resources from the West, the steady attrition of Russia's attacks will eventually pay off, making it very difficult for Ukraine to hold ground, let alone liberate areas already occupied by the Russians. That's how Putin wins. It does not need to step back or take over Kiev. He just needs to prolong things and wait for Western political support to collapse. However, it is worth emphasizing that these are possibilities. When we look at the current developments, the achievements of the Russian leader's goals is beyond dreams. A dream does not become reality by magic. It takes sweat, determination, and hard work. The army that meets these conditions is the army of Kiev. I think Zelensky's dream of Crimea will come true one day. Thanks for watching.